Hey, welcome to 12-Tone Building Blocks, our monthly series about the fundamentals of music theory. So far, when we've talked about scales, we've only been looking at major and minor, so today Actually, hold on, let's look at those a little closer. Here's D major, and here's B minor. And if we look at the notes, we see they're exactly the same. So if they have the same notes, are they really different scales? Do major and minor actually exist? And if so, how do we tell them apart? Well, up to now, we've mostly been talking about scales as just collections of notes, but that's not quite true. I mean, they are that, but they also tell us how those notes behave. The way that the notes and chords of a scale sound has less to do with their absolute pitch and more to do with their relationship to the root of the key. In D major, the note C sharp is what's called the leading tone, and it really wants to resolve upward to the D. In B minor, on the other hand, that same C sharp is the second degree of the scale, and it's a lot more stable. This gives D major and B minor what's called a relative relationship. They're different scales, but they're made of the same notes. The only thing that separates them is how those notes are used. But D and B aren't the only notes in that collection. What happens if we try to make something else our new root? This brings us to a really important idea in scale theory. Modes. A mode is basically just that, all the notes of a parent scale but with a different root. Every scale has them, but for today let's just focus on D major. If we start on D, well, we just get D major again, although if you want to be fancy you can call it D Ionian. If we move on to E though, we get something a little more interesting. This is E Dorian, which is kind of like the minor scale but with a raised 6th degree. It has a nice folky sound to it, and it lets you make minor harmonies that aren't quite so dark and sad. If we start on F sharp, we get F sharp Phrygian, which is kind of the opposite of Dorian. It's the minor scale but with a lowered second, and it sounds even darker. It's a really good scale to use if you want your music to sound evil, and it's unsurprisingly popular in metal. Moving on to G, we get something totally different. This is G Lydian, and it's the major scale with a raised 4th. It has a really interesting sound because the half step between the 3rd and 4th degrees is such an important driver of dissonance in major, and lifting the 4th up gives you a scale with almost no dissonance at all. It's good for dreamlike compositions that don't want to give a strong sense of motion. If we start on A, we get A Mixolydian, which drops the 4th back down and also lowers the 7th. This gives us what's called a dominant scale because if we build a chord from the root, we get a dominant 7th. Mixolydian is a hard scale to write in because it has the strong directional sound that defines dominant chords, but it's really useful as a chord scale, a temporary scale played over a specific chord in the harmony. We've already covered starting on B, which gives us B minor, or in the language of modes, B Aeolian. Starting on C sharp though, gives us the strangest mode of all, Locrian. Locrian is like minor, but with a lowered 2nd and a lowered 5th, which means that if we build a chord from its root, we get a diminished triad. This makes the whole scale very unstable, and writing a chord progression that actually feels like it's in Locrian is incredibly difficult. It's a great tool for riffs and melodies though, and much like Phrygian, it's popular in metal. So that's where modes come from, but in practice it's often not helpful to think of them in terms of their relationship to major. Each one is a scale in its own right, and a good way to understand their unique sounds is to look at which ones are the most similar to each other. Let's start again with D major. We'll take this as our default sound. If we raise the 4th, we get D Lydian, the only mode brighter than major. If we instead lower the 7th, we get D Mixolydian, which is almost like major but with a little extra instability thrown in at the end. Moving on, if we lower Mixolydian's 3rd degree, we get D Dorian, but really it doesn't sound much like Mixolydian at all. The 3rd degree is so important in defining a scale's sound that Dorian winds up sounding more like a brighter, less sad minor. Speaking of which, if we lower Dorian's 6th, we get to D Aeolian, which as we've seen is just minor. Then if we lower the 2nd degree, we get to D Phrygian, which as we mentioned is like minor but with more of an edge, and finally if we lower the 5th degree, we get D Locrian, the darkest mode. But what happens if we keep going? Well, the only note we haven't lowered yet is the root, and if we do that, we're back to Lydian, built off a D flat. That's pretty much it, but before we go, a brief side note on notation. In the keys video, we mentioned that major and minor are the only key signatures we use, and that's still relevant here. If you're writing in E Dorian, you don't use the key signature for D major, even though it has all the right notes. Instead, you use the one for E minor, and then whenever you need a C sharp, you just add it in by hand. This is so that people reading your score can quickly identify what the root is without having to analyze the whole song first. Anyway, thanks for watching. Building Blocks was made possible thanks to our patrons on Patreon, so if you want to see more stuff like this, please consider supporting. You can also check out our store, join our mailing list, like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.